Hello. On behalf of the Northwest Mental Health Technology Center, I'd like to welcome everyone to today's webinar. I'm Adrienne Scavera, the Director of Training and Outreach for Mental Health and Addiction Association of Oregon, a Northwest MHTTC partner. In collaboration with the MHTTC, we provide free monthly community of practices for adult peer support specialists and supervisors of peer workers. We are excited to bring today's webinar to you with trauma-informed care specialist Kristin Griffey, discussing the parallel process, trauma-informed considerations for individuals and organizations. This 60-minute webinar is sponsored by the Northwest Mental Health Technology Transfer Center. The MHTTC network is a nationwide effort that is supported by the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration with the purpose of disseminating and implementing evidence-based practices for mental health disorders into the behavioral health workforce. The MHTTC network consists of a National Coordinating Office, or NCO, 10 regional centers, a Tribal Affairs Center, and a Hispanic and Latino Center. Together, our collaborative network supports resource development and dissemination, training and technical assistance, and workforce development to the mental health field throughout the United States. The Northwest MHTTC is based at the University of Washington in the Department of Psychiatry and Behavioral Sciences. We provide training and technical assistance, or TA, in evidence-based practices to behavioral health and primary care providers and school and social service staff, whose work has the potential to improve behavioral health outcomes for individuals with or who are at risk of developing serious mental illness in Region 10 of Alaska, Idaho, Oregon, and Washington. Broadly, our goals at the Northwest MHTTC are to heighten awareness, knowledge, and skills of the workforce, addressing the needs of individuals who experience mental illness, accelerate adoption and implementation of mental health-related evidence-based practices across Region 10, and foster alliances amongst culturally diverse mental health providers, policymakers, family members, and clients. I'd like to take a moment to speak briefly to the importance of language. It is our intention to always be mindful of using language that promotes recovery and culturally appropriate terminology. We encourage all clinicians to use and champion person-first language, which emphasizes the individual, not the condition or disability. Person-first language is a way to demonstrate respect for a person's dignity and worth. It is consistent with recovery-oriented practices and promotes treatment environments that foster respect, human dignity, and hope. And before we get started, we'd like to take a moment to ask who we have here with us today. You should see a poll up on your screen that has several response options about the role that you play in your organization. You'll also see that one of those response options is other. If that is true for you, please feel free to type in your role category in the comment box. So we'll leave this up for a little bit, and then we will take a look at who all we have with us here today on this webinar. So I'm seeing a number of responses come in. Thank you so much for responding to this poll. It looks like a good majority are other. Folks who would consider themselves other. About 9% of folks are peer support specialists, 10% clinicians, 9% healthcare administrators, 24%, or about a quarter, social workers, 8% educators, and a whopping 41% other. So it looks like a number of folks are sharing their responses to other, administration, social worker from VHA, curriculum developer, student, certified alcohol and drug counselors, research managers. So it looks like we've got a great variety of folks here with us on this webinar today. So I would like to welcome, and it really is my pleasure to introduce, today's presenter, Kristin Griffey, trauma-informed care specialist with Mental Health and Addiction Association of Oregon. Kristin recognizes that when human beings experience trauma and/or severe life stressors, it is not uncommon for lives to unravel. Empowering others to weave beautiful tapestries with their threads is one of Kristin's greatest joys. Kristin is a mom, a friend, and a fierce advocate who obtained her personal history degree, or PhD, of lived experience in Portland, and has polished her expertise with what she would consider book learning that added trauma-informed care specialist, community and workplace traumatologist, and compassion fatigue specialist hats to her wardrobe. Kristin believes deeply in trauma-informed care and providing space for those who may be struggling with compassion fatigue. We are very excited to have Kristin share more about her work with us today. So we have another brief poll for everyone before we get started here. And this poll, which should be showing up visible on your screen, asks about familiarity with trauma-informed care. So please take a moment to respond to that poll. I'm already seeing some responses come in. Thank you so much for being so prompt. It looks like we've got a good number of people who are really skewing towards the somewhat familiar to extremely familiar end of the familiarity with trauma-informed care. The largest percentage of those of us who are on this webinar today would consider ourselves to be moderately familiar with trauma-informed care at 42%, followed by somewhat familiar at 24%, 23% extremely familiar, 10% slightly familiar, and the smallest percentage being not at all familiar with trauma-informed care. So I hope we have some great learning that happens today on the webinar, and I would like to, at this point, thank all of you, and again, welcome our presenter, Kristin Griffey, as we delve into the parallel process, trauma-informed considerations for individuals and organizations.
Thank you, Adrienne, and I thank everyone who is joining us today. I'm very excited about this topic. Again, my name is Kristin Griffey, and I would like to let everyone know that I came into the peer wellness specialist role when Oregon began to become billable, which was right around 2012. I identified as having had mental health challenges, and that my mental health challenges largely stemmed from a single event trauma that happened when I was 18 years old. Throughout the years since that trauma occurred, I was diagnosed with postpartum depression because a lot of my symptoms came out when I was pregnant with my first child. I was then diagnosed with generalized anxiety disorder, major depressive disorder, and then later in life, PTSD. PTSD was not an option back in the days when I was diagnosed with postpartum generalized anxiety and major depressive disorder. I came from a medical family. I have a mom who was a lifelong emergency room nurse. My grandfather was a doctor. My great-grandfather was a doctor. And my first real experience with peer support came when I was taken to the emergency department the night of the trauma that occurred to me, and I was introduced to a rape victim advocate. Intuitively, I would have thought, or one would have thought, that maybe I would have clung to doctors and nurses because that is what I was familiar with. But I will say that I really held on to my rape victim advocate, because in my place of fear, I believed that she identified with me the most and would keep me safe. Peer support does take on many forms, and I'm just speaking from, in Oregon here, we have peer wellness specialists, peer support specialists, peer employment specialists, certified recovery mentors, certified peer counselors, and so on. And so today I will use the term peer support specialist to describe peer support, and I say that knowing that and honoring that there may be other titles out there for peer support specialists. Peer support is a system of giving and receiving help, and it's founded on key principles of respect, shared responsibility, and mutual agreement of what is helpful. Peer support is not based on psychiatric models and diagnostic criteria. I would consider peer support to be more holistic, and I'm grateful that does exist. I think it's really important to talk about compassion fatigue. Compassion fatigue has been around for 35 to 40 years. There's a little bit of discrepancy on where it was first discovered, but as far back as what I have been able to trace compassion fatigue was from an article by Charles Figley called The Cost of Caring, and that was in 1982. Also saw that it came up again in some books that were by two psychologists, Lorianne Perlman and Karen W. Sackvenay, and it was books called Trauma and the Therapist and Transforming the Pain. Those were written in 1996. So compassion fatigue has been around 35 to 40 years. And in the book, Trauma and the Therapist, what was basically part of the summary is that people who do work in human services are vulnerable to a special type of burnout or toxic stress that in some ways look like PTSD and actually produces symptoms that are lingering and they don't go away. In fact, could get worse if they're not acknowledged. Compassion fatigue is considered to be burnout, which is 100% systemic. Anyone can get burnout just from working in any system. So compassion fatigue equals burnout plus vicarious trauma, which would be a cumulative effect of hearing similar stories over and over again that might be what I would consider to be heavy stories. It could also be burnout plus secondary traumatic stress, which would be what I would consider the glass crunching under my feet as I am assisting somebody who may have just been in a car accident. And so I'm actually also getting some of that traumatic experience in my own system, in my own body. It also can be burnout plus moral distress. And a really good example of moral distress that I've had lately has been, I work with a lot of peer supports who do recovery work, who are certified recovery mentors. And for some of them, MAT, which is medication-assisted therapy, is very welcome. And for some, it's a little activating because their own recovery came from a different lens. And so that would be just an overview. So compassion fatigue, which has been around really for about 35 years, is burnout plus vicarious trauma, secondary traumatic stress, or moral distress, or any of those three things. It's important, and you can even, it's really important to think about where we are putting the stories that we carry at the end of our days. And I'll say that from a couple of different points. And one of it is that as somebody who came in from a traumatic event and who identified as someone who had mental health challenges, I went from a story that I never talked about to a story that was essential in order for me to connect. What I found out in the process of speaking and talking about my story is that that in itself also had a cumulative effect on my mental health. I was, so to speak, reliving and re-speaking my story in a way that I had not been educated on how to do. And so my way of telling a story when I first became a peer wellness specialist was like the news. If it bleeds, it leads, and I'm going to be the first one that has all the gory details just to prove how pure I am. And that sounds horrible, but I want to be really honest about that, because coming into the field of peer support, having it be a new field, I felt in my own self that I needed to just show other people how resilient I was. And how I did that was by saying my story in a way that probably didn't serve a lot of people. I call that sliming. That's how I was trained when I became a compassion fatigue specialist. And it is very important, just as Adrienne pointed out in the beginning of the seminar, that language does matter. And so does the language that we use when we are working with other people who may also be in a traumatic situation. The accumulation of the stories that we carry at the end of the day, and on any given day, as I was working direct service and peer support, I could have been contacting one person who was going and helping that person to navigate different systems, or I could be meeting with 4, 5, 6 people a day. When I was doing homeless, I was working on a homeless outreach team, and that was to help people do barrier reductions, to look into affordable places to live, and just to help with all of that. And it really was a lot of secondary traumatic stress. It was a lot of you know, the glass under my feet, because I did spend a lot of time in the community. I did spend a lot of time in camps for people who were living outside and whatnot. So it's really, really important to really think about, where do the stories that you carry go at the end of the day? And one of the things that I do try to remind people is that there's the slime, which is what I talked about, and that's kind of just letting everybody within earshot hear all about it. There's another thing that's called informed consent, and informed consent allows the other person to make that choice of whether or not they are going to be that set of ears to help you to get that story out of your own body. And so I just remind people that when sharing your own story, and even when working with peers who are sharing their stories, to just keep in mind the difference between sliming and informed consent. And I've actually helped some of my peers revamp and just kind of write their story a little bit from a more strengths-based, just being able to share their stories in a more strengths-based, also knowing that I could hold the space for folks if they needed or wanted to dump it off in a way that wasn't so pretty. I'll have you go into the next one. Next slide, Adrienne. Thank you. She, again, did talk about a study that was done by Kaiser Permanente, and it was the Foundation for Trauma-Informed Care Framework, which showed those things that I just talked about. I also want you to know that a study is actually pretty old by this point, and people have relooked at it now through a more modern lens or a more contemporary lens, and also acknowledge that for some children, they are born into social conditions and contexts in which they are already vulnerable. And in fact, there are many historical traumas, multi-generational traumas and oppressions in many groups. But what she found was that if we just operated on the idea that each person that we connect with in our in our daily jobs, in our peer support, whatever that looks like to you, is that if someone had not had trauma, it was not going to harm them to treat them in a trauma-informed way. So there are 6 principles to trauma-informed care, and the guiding principles are safety, trustworthiness and transparency, peer support, collaboration and mutuality, empowerment, which would be voice and choice, and cultural, historical, and gender issues. I want to point out peer support, as much as I would love the peer support to be all the peer support that I work with and that I support who are being trained in, what this actually means is that a peer who is a peer to the person who is experiencing the trauma. So we have in trauma-informed care, we have hospitals that are using trauma-informed care guiding principles, and therefore doctors need peer support. Nurses who have been in similar situations as peer support. And so this is actually having people who understand the group or the culture of how they are experiencing the trauma. The reason that I say that is because we're going to get into the parallel process, and that's just a really important piece of the parallel process. I really like how Sandra Bloom talks about trauma-informed, and she says, a trauma-informed organization is one that recognizes the inherent vulnerability of all human beings to the effects of trauma and organizes system-wide interventions aimed at mitigating the negative effects of adversity and stress that are manifested in the clients served and the organization itself. Now, as a peer support specialist at heart, I would say my peers served and the organization itself, but I think that that's a very poignant quote. And what we do know about people who are working with populations that experience trauma is that if you have, or if a person has trauma history in their own background, that they are actually at higher risk for developing compassion. So now what? Not trying to put a downer on anyone's day, and I need to let everyone here know that peer support was a life changer for myself and everyone that I know that has been working in this. What can we do to sustain our recovery and to sustain our workforce? There is a thing called a parallel process, and the parallel process talks about in 3 areas, and it talks about clients and staff and organization. And what it says is that if clients and staff feel unsafe, then the organization is viewed as unsafe. If clients are, and again, I'm going to put the disclaimer out that I would be saying peers, so peers and staff, if they feel angry and aggressive, then staff may have an angry or aggressive response, and the organization might act in a punitive way. If clients are feeling helpless, staff feels helpless, organizations might feel stuck. If clients and staff feel hopeless, then an organization might feel missionless. If clients and staff are hyper aroused, then an organization might become crisis driven. If clients and staff are overwhelmed, an organization might be overwhelmed. If clients are confused and staff is confused, then an organization might feel valueless. If clients are depressed, if staff is demoralized, then an organization might feel directionless. And so it's a parallel process that's going on. In workforce wellness, between the individual level and the organizational level, emotional wellness, social wellness, physical wellness and professional wellness will always mirror back and forth in that parallel process. What I personally take the parallel process to mean is that we are only as good and generous and kind and sensitive to those we serve as our agencies are to us. That is how I see the parallel process. We might be able to start out, hit the ground running and keep it up for a while, but the parallel process says that if we are, as peer support specialists, not being considered as a population that can be experiencing trauma, then most likely we will develop some sort of compassion fatigue and or our recovery process might look different.
Thank you, Kristin. This is Adrienne. Those are great points. I'm wondering if we can take a moment to check in with our participants to see what steps they or their organizations have taken to become more trauma-informed. So I'm going to bring up another poll for everyone just to see what steps you, whether this is as an individual or as an organization, have taken to become more trauma-informed. It looks like across the board, all of the various responses do have some folks who are selecting them, but there certainly are a couple that are showing up as most primary. So I'm going to leave it up for about another 10 seconds, and then I will be sharing the poll with everyone so you all can see what steps you or your organizations and your peers have taken to become more trauma-informed. At 87% of respondents have taken training or read materials on how to be more trauma-informed, opportunities like this one, followed by encouraged self-care, 81%, at 37%, incorporated peer or consumer voice into organizational policies and practices, 33% adopted trauma-informed ways of being with others or as an organization, with 31% of our respondents have utilized trauma-informed supervision models. 25% have modified service delivery or services offered to be more trauma-informed. And finally, 13% have reduced staff workload or caseload to be more trauma-informed. Thank you all for taking a moment to share what steps you or your organizations have taken to become more trauma-informed.
Thank you, and I really do believe that, and something that I would just like to just put out there and invite others to think about is that trauma-informed care is really about that shift from what's wrong with you to what happened to you. And what happened to you maybe doesn't normalize behaviors that are happening or reactions that are happening due to trauma. And so it actually is just a good belief system, in my opinion, because we can pathologize a lot of the things that come from trauma, but if we're actually working with it, I believe that it's a more holistic approach. Did I get mine in there twice? So the parallel process, again, it means to me, and this is how I took it, is that we're only as good and generous and kind and sensitive to those we serve and our agencies are to us. Something that I'd like to say about trauma-informed care is that I really believe it's a holographic growth process. I believe that that we can be in any given one of the 4 stages, really, which are trauma aware, trauma sensitive, trauma responsive, and trauma informed at various times. We might be actually in the recognition and awareness stage, and and simultaneously being trauma responsive by creating plans. We may be implementing certain things in the trauma informed stage, and yet really we're just foundationally building from a trauma sensitive level. And so I just invite people to really think about that. Much like recovery, it is a non-linear, it's really a non-linear process that that growth process can happen all different ways at all different times. That's in my experience. So some of the things that we've been doing at MHAAO, which is the Mental Health and Addiction Association of Oregon, is that we have created what is called peer support for the peer supporter. And what that looks like in for us is that we do things like Connection 101, and that would be going back and talking a little bit about how to share stories, or how to reduce sliming, and how to really be intentional on and inviting to people who you're sharing your stories with, because not everybody might be up for that. It's another thing that we do that's called a hot walk and a talk, and that comes from just we've had peers, peer support specialists who have had incidences that have happened with peers who have maybe overdosed or lost life, or any number of very traumatic things that have happened. And sometimes we will just get together and we'll do a hot walk and a talk, which says that we are going to talk it out, we're going to walk it out, and we're going to flush it out with our water, and get all that cortisol and whatnot that's pumping through our bodies, flush the adrenal glands, and not have it continue to live in us. We also do groups for peers who are working in hospital settings. We currently are running groups at OHSU and Emmanuel hospitals. We do those groups because it not only helps to kind of release the steam from being in that hospital setting, but it also helps our peer supports to build natural supports with other peers who are working in maybe as the only peer on a team, or just working in those hospital settings. We also have compassion satisfaction groups, which is the best thing about working in peer support, is that we do actually get a lot of really good things from doing this work. We really do. And because our brains are so negative biased, that sometimes it takes really that just that intent on getting together and talking about our compassion satisfaction. I do some things that involve mapping, really kind of going in and talking about what's your mantra in this, and what is it, what brought you here, and really talking about what are all the things that let you survive, that got you to this point, and how are you using those things. Another thing that we are getting into, and I do the peer supervision for a couple of our Project Nurture peer teams, and that is how to maintain the fidelity of peer support during crises. In a crisis setting, you're using different parts of the brain, and sometimes boundaries might feel a little bit different, but just really kind of normalizing and validating that those things do come up, and creating safety nets around those kind of situations to help the peers, the peer support, and knowing that by strengthening our own muscle there is only going to lend help to better help our community partners and the peers that we are working with. And so it sounds like really a lot of people, like I said earlier, have good information or have a good understanding of trauma-informed care. And as I'm looking at the trauma-informed organization poll and what steps people are taking, it looks like a lot of people are taking a lot of really good steps. We do have a handout that can help folks to help perform a trauma-informed self-assessment, organizational assessments. We ask that another way that you can commit to being trauma-informed is to really make sure that all staff is trained in the trauma-informed principles and the impact of trauma. Something that I will never forget is I was at a behavioral health conference in 2012, and one of the first people that I heard talk about this stuff said, when we talk about training staff, we talk about from people who are cleaning the buildings all the way up to people who are delivering the bottled water and everyone in between. And so that's a really important piece of it, because every person is likely to come in contact with one of my peers or one of the people visiting, whether it's a hospital, behavioral health center, or whatnot. As an individual, again, I go back to that belief system, that trauma-informed care is a belief system. It's not saying what is wrong with this person. It's really asking the question, what has happened to this person? And I would just ask also just kind of evaluating your own belief system in regards to trauma, and have a supported and open conversation with your team to just kind of to talk about it and see how that is.
So thank you so much, Kristin, for all of the really valuable information that you have shared with all of us today, and thank you everyone for being here as well. We're now compiling some questions to review with Kristin in a moment. As a reminder, if you had any questions, please submit those in the Q&A box. We have one question right now, and this is from Jacqueline. And the question is, so you say there are more current studies of ACEs. Where might I find these to gain more information? Kristin, can you share a little bit more information about that?
Yeah, so where I personally have gotten information has been within my own county, which is Washington County ACEs. And I can actually, I'm happy to.
I'm seeing another question come through in the chat box. Aside from training, what kinds of things can agency leadership be doing to address compassion fatigue for their direct services workers?
That is a great question, and I actually have my own thoughts about that. And one of my thoughts about that comes from my compassion fatigue trainer, who was Francois Mathieu from the TEND Academy, and she really talks about how self-care can become a little bit shaming, because people who are doing this work, particularly who have had trauma in their own histories and who are opening their hearts wide, are more likely to become impacted by compassion fatigue. So what I really try to put into people's minds is to add things into your day, add things into your schedule. And I know that I'm letting you know that I shake my head right now. Like, how can I add anything else into my day? I promise you, just a few minutes a day, just giving yourself those couple minute breaks throughout your day, the hot walk and the talk, the being mindful of not sliming all over everyone. And so actually, instead of having self-care be an external thing that we talk about doing more of, that it be really built into the work environment. And one of the things that I bring up is Google has a slide. Google has a slide, and they actually put things in there, which sounds maybe ridiculous, but I'm just saying, man, there are many times that I would have been really happy to just have something to take my mind off of things.
Yes, thank you, Kristin. This is Adrienne, and I'd like to add a really brief, it takes maybe 15 to 30 seconds tool that Kristin had shared with me, which was sort of a brain teaser where you look around the room and name things incorrectly. So if I'm looking at a lamp, I might say potato. So by doing that, we're disrupting ourselves, and that can really help in terms of being more mindful and really bringing ourselves more into the moment. So that is something that was free, very, very brief, requires no materials or resources, but that was something that I've learned from Kristin myself.
Yes, mindfulness.
Sorry, go ahead, and then we've got
I was gonna thank you for that, Adrienne. Mindfulness can just be a 30-second reset. It doesn't have to be a 20-minute meditation, although that is very good. I'm not taking away from that, but sometimes just resetting. The other thing that I would add is having a transition from your work to your home is a very powerful thing to do as well.
Thank you, Kristin. One more question from the Q&A box. Can you recommend specific documents or trainings for an organization that will benefit from a company-wide training on provision of trauma-informed care?
So I could recommend a couple that are my favorites if you would like me to send some links to. The other thing that comes to mind is that we worked with Brass Tacks as well, who personally created a questionnaire for us as an agency, and then helped in our diversity, equity, and inclusion committee to create leadership in trauma-informed care that would be able to reach everyone within our organization. And then on top of that, we did implement some different policies and some things that would perhaps mitigate or ameliorate the impact of trauma. And that was one of those things was the peer support for peer support with the various groups and things that we are running.
Thank you, Kristin. I'm seeing a comment in the Q&A box to look at fish philosophy. So we will be checking that out. And there is an additional question for an explanation of hot walk and talk. Kristin, do you want to talk about that for a minute?
Yes, that was hot walk and a talk is something that was that I learned in my compassion fatigue training, and Francois Mathieu actually, they have water bottles that are labeled hot walk and a talk. And whenever somebody comes in and has had a very activating experience or things are kind of building up, then there is somebody that is available, and in the realm that we use it, it's peer support for peer support. But somebody is available to actually grab one of those water bottles side by side, take a 5-minute walk, and just walk it out, talk it out, and flush it out. And that's another just a 5-minute activity that will help, because trauma means wound. And what we're trying to do is we're trying to to stop that wound from becoming an infection. And these are the things that we're learning that help so that the trauma doesn't stay trapped within our minds and in our bodies. And so that is just a really good proactive piece that people can work or can use in the community, any place that they're at, just by having other people know the term hot walk and a talk, and then maybe talking about like what that actually does for our bodies and how it helps to mitigate and even ameliorate trauma.
Thank you, Kristin. I see one more question has come through the Q&A box, and this one is county resource specific to Washington County in Oregon. Where in Washington County may we find trauma-informed training for individuals is the question. Are you aware of any Washington County resources for training, Kristin?
So what I know is that specific to Washington County, so in Washington County, we provide peer support for peer support that is working in Washington County. We also have presentations that we can come and do and talk about trauma-informed care. And so that is something that is available through us as well. I don't know off the top of my head other people who are training it. I'm imagining that we are going to find more out at Purepocalypse about that, which is our big conference that we do in April, and people come together and share resources.
Great, thank you, Kristin. I don't see any additional questions in the Q&A box. Again, thank Kristin so much for responding to these questions and for the incredible information that you've shared. I would like to take a moment to share some information about the MHTTC. If you would like to find out about additional resources and training opportunities, you can visit us online and sign up for our newsletter at www.mhttcnetwork.org/Northwest. And we are also officially on social media, both Facebook and Twitter, at Northwest MHTTC. You can also see both of those on your screen. If you'd like to get in touch with the center or have additional questions that we didn't have the opportunity to address today, you may also email us at northwest@mhttcnetwork.org. I also want to take a brief moment to share about a few additional training opportunities that will be coming up. Please save the date on May 13th from 1 to 2 p.m. Pacific Standard Time for an MHTTC webinar with a focus on deepening understanding of peer support. Another free opportunity that is available is a free online community of practice held via Zoom online for 1 hour once monthly. Our community of practices are for all peer workers and supervisors of peer workers across Region 10. We welcome you to join us, and you may sign up to be added to the mailing list via the link on the slide. So we welcome folks to join us through those community of practices as well, which are done in collaboration and sponsored by the Mental Health Technology Transfer Center.